The year was 1879, and the Arizona Territory was bleeding its color onto the horizon. The sun, a swollen, weeping eye, dragged itself down behind the black volcanic teeth of Cinder Mesa, setting the sky ablaze in shades of rust, dried blood, and bruised apricot. The light, thick and heavy as syrup, poured over the parched land, illuminating every crack in the earth, every spine on the skeletal saguaros. Below the mesa, the dry comet wash lay exposed, a white, gravel-toothed scar where water had long ago surrendered to the heat. It was a land that demanded everything and gave nothing without a fight. And Calder Wren was a fighter, though he did not know it. He stood on the warped planks of his small porch, shoulders slumped, watching the last of the light die. This was his first winter managing the ranch alone. His father, a man made of iron and silence, had worked himself into the grave 6 months prior, leaving Calder with 20 head of bony cattle, a mortgage note in Tucson he could barely read, and a profound, aching loneliness that had become his only real companion. Calder was 24, though the sun and the worry had carved the lines of a much older man around his eyes. He was tall, but he moved with an awkward, lurching grace, as if he were constantly apologizing for the space he occupied. His hands were competent, scarred and calloused from mending fences, birthing calves, and burying his own father. But they were clumsy when it came to anything else. He rarely went to the nearby settlement of Sable Arroyo. When he did, the townsfolk noted his downcast eyes, his stammering replies, and his utter lack of guile. They had a name for him, whispered behind the swinging doors of the Oxbow Saloon, the Virgin Rancher. It was not entirely inaccurate. Calder's life had been a closed loop of work, dust, and survival. He knew the language of the wind and the moods of his cattle, but the currency of men, and especially of women, was a foreign tongue. The temperature dropped with the suddenness of a blade. The desert night did not creep in. It seized the land. A chill wind, carrying the scent of juniper and cold stone, snaked its way up the wash. Calder pulled his worn canvas coat tighter, his thoughts already turning to the feed, the water pump, the endless list of chores that kept the dread at bay. That was when he heard it. It was not a loud noise. It was a soft, metallic click, a scrape, from the direction of the stables and the adjoining grain shed. It was a sound that did not belong. Calder's body went rigid. His horses, usually restless at this hour, were silent, too silent. He was not a man given to panic, but a cold prickle moved up his spine. Bandits were a threat, but so were wandering prospectors, drunk and desperate, or displaced Apache, pushed to the brink by the cavalry and the ever-shrinking reservations. His hand went not to a holstered pistol, he owned one, but rarely wore it, but to the old Spencer carbine leaning just inside the doorway. The wood was smooth and dark with the oil of his father's hands. And then his own. It was a heavy, reliable piece of history. He checked the load. The familiar shuck of the mechanism, a small comfort in the vast, encroaching darkness. He did not light a lantern. He moved off the porch, his boots making almost no sound in the thick dust he'd neglected to sweep. He used the shadows as his father had taught him, moving along the line of the warped corral fence, keeping the rising moon at his back. The stable was a dark maw. The grain shed, attached to its side, was where he kept his winter stores, his cornmeal, his dried beans, his flour, his life. He paused by the stable door, listening. He heard the nervous stamp of a hoof, a soft snort. They smelled a stranger. He eased his way to the grain shed. The side door, which was usually barred, was open a crack. A sliver of moonlight cut across the floorboards. He raised the Spencer, his thumb on the hammer, and pushed the door open with his foot. The air inside was thick with the sweet, dusty smell of milled corn, and something else, sweat, fear, and a wild, earthy scent he could not place. At first, he saw only a shadow, a disruption in the dark. It was large, far larger than he'd expected, huddled over an open sack of cornmeal. "Hold right there," Calder said. His voice was a rusty croak, rough from disuse. The shadow froze. Then Slowly, it rose and rose. Calder's breath caught in his throat. This was no man. The figure that stood before him was a woman, but a woman unlike any he had ever seen. Even in his dreams, she was tall, taller than he was. And Calder was not a small man. She was, he thought in a daze, as tall as a smoke column rising in the still morning air. Her shoulders were broad, muscular, defined beneath a torn buckskin shirt that was not her own. Her hair was a black, matted curtain, thick with burrs and dust. The moonlight caught her face. Her skin was the color of fired brick, scorched by the sun. Not born to it, but it was her eyes that stopped his heart. They were deep-set, almond-shaped, and utterly, profoundly exhausted. She was Apache. She was also starving. She held a double handful of dry cornmeal, and she had been in the act of lifting it to her mouth. The meal trickled from between her fingers, dusting the floor. Her gaze flicked from his face to the muzzle of the Spencer, then back to his face. Calder's eyes, trained to notice every detail in his cattle, took her in. She was not just hungry. She was broken. Dried, flaking mud was caked to her knees, as if she had been crawling for miles. Her feet were bare, bloody and cracked, and on her wrists, stark against that sun-darkened skin, were raw, weeping burns, rope burns, chafed and rubbed with dirt until they were infected. A story of flight, of desperation, was written on her body. The silence in the shed stretched, pulled thin as wire. It was broken only by the sound of Calder's own pulse drumming in his ears and the faint hiss of the woman's breathing. He saw the muscles in her jaw tense. He saw the cold, hunted guard in her eyes, the look of an animal cornered and ready to fight, even if it was the last thing it ever did. Then, as she held his gaze, that cold fire wavered, guttered, and was replaced by a weariness so total it was almost a physical weight. The fight left her. She did not lower her eyes, but the challenge in them died. She had run her last mile. Calder had raised the rifle to defend his property. He had seen this woman, this thief, and his first instinct had been the ironclad rule of the territory: protect what is yours. But the man who stood there now was not the son of his father, or the virgin rancher of Sable Arroyo. He was just a man, looking at a fellow creature in desperate, agonizing need. The rope burns, the exhaustion, the simple animal act of eating dry meal from a sack. His knuckles were white on the rifle stock. He swallowed, the sound loud in the small space. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered the barrel of the Spencer until it pointed at the dusty floor. The woman's eyes widened. Just a fraction. Take it, Calder said. The words felt strange in his mouth. Take the meal. She did not move. She watched him, wary as a hawk. Go on, he said, and he winced at the roughness of his own voice. He cleared his throat. Take it, and be gone by morning. He was not offering charity. He was offering a truce. He was giving her the night, the cover of darkness, to be on her way. He did not want to know where she came from, or who was looking for her. He did not want this complication in his life. He just wanted her gone. For another long moment, she simply stared. He could see her weighing his words, his posture, the lowered rifle. She was judging him. Then, with a fluid, economical motion that spoke of a life lived with purpose, she bent. She did not use the sack. She cupped her hands. Scooping a generous measure of the meal into a folded, ragged piece of hide she pulled from her waistband. She stood again to her full, imposing height. She looked at him. Loma Nyende did not say thank you. Such a word was a luxury, a social grease for a world that had clearly and violently rejected her. Instead, she gave him something else. She tilted her head. A short, sharp inclination. It was not a gesture of submission. It was a gesture of acknowledgement. It was a sign from one sovereign being to another. It was a flash of the pride that had not been burned out of her, or starved out of her, or beaten out of her. It was the most powerful thing Calder Wren had ever witnessed. Then, she was gone. She did not run. She did not scurry. She turned and slipped through the doorway. a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. Calder did not move, did not even breathe, until he heard the faint crunch of a single pebble outside. He stepped out of the shed. The moon was higher now, casting the yard in a stark, silver and black relief. There was no sign of her. He scanned the landscape, the dark line of the Chola Ridge in the distance. She had vanished, absorbed back into the land that had clearly forged her. Calder Wren stood alone in the cold, the heavy Spencer suddenly a useless weight in his hands. He felt the place on the porch where he had been standing, the familiar, dull ache of his solitude. But something had changed. The air felt different. His heart, usually a slow, steady drumbeat against his ribs, was hammering. It was a strange, erratic rhythm, a beat he did not recognize. It was not fear. It was not anger. It was something else. He had looked into the face of a strength so fierce and a sorrow so deep. They seemed to be the same thing. A gust of wind, stronger this time, tore through the few skeletal cypress trees his father had planted by the porch. It sounded like a long, drawn-out sigh, a whisper that seemed to carry the echo of that single, proud gesture. It was the sound of a promise. Though none had been spoken, it was the sound of a door opening. Just a crack, in a life that had been locked shut for a very long time. The dawn broke cold and gray, a stark contrast to the fiery death of the previous evening. Calder had not slept. He had sat in his father's chair, the old Spencer leaning against the wall, listening to the tiny, furtive sounds of the desert night, wondering if every scrape of a branch was her return, or something worse. He felt hollowed out, as if the encounter in the grain shed had scooped something from his core and left a raw, vibrating space behind. He rose before the sun had fully breached the mesa, his movement stiff. He made coffee, the familiar ritual of flimsy defense against the newness of the day. He expected the yard to be empty, the night to have erased the encounter, leaving it as a dream born of loneliness and shadows. He opened the front door and stopped. On the top step of the porch, placed with deliberate care, was a bundle of dried yucca fibers, tightly bound, perfect for mending harness or weaving a durable rope. Beside it lay a tool. It was a knife, but not one from any white man's forge. The handle was a short, smooth piece of bone. The blade was a shard of obsidian, chipped to a wicked glass-like edge and secured to the handle with perfectly wrapped sinew. It was a gift. No, not a gift. It was payment. It was a thank you spoken in the language of survival, a language Calder understood far better than the useless pleasantries of Sable Arroyo. The cornmeal had been a necessity. This was a reply. It was a statement of dignity. I am not a beggar. Calder stood there for a long time, the cold air burning his lungs. He touched the obsidian. It was cold, sharp, and lethally beautiful. It was a tool of a person who knew how to live off the bones of the land, a person who had given away one of her own tools in exchange for a bag of meal. He turned, went back inside to his stores, and fetched a fresh, full sack of cornmeal. He walked back to the porch, placed the bag precisely where the yucca and knife had been, and then picked up the items. The knife felt balanced in his hand. He looked toward the Chola Ridge, a black silhouette against the pearly sky. Then, honoring the silence of their exchange, he turned his back and walked to the stables to begin his morning chores. He did not look back. The next few days, the ranch changed. The silence was still there, but it was no longer empty. It was occupied. On the second morning, he went to the well. His shoulders braced for the familiar, aching pull of the rope. He found the bucket already drawn and brimming with fresh, cold water. He looked around. There were footprints in the damp earth by the well's stone lip. They were small, considering her height, and distinctly bare. On the third night, a skittish coyote pack, drawn by the scent of his cattle, began their yipping, howling chorus. Calder grabbed his rifle, but before he reached the door, a single, sharp crack of a thrown rock against the canyon wall, a sound he never could have made, sent the pack scattering into silence. He stood at his window, peering into the darkness, and saw nothing. But he knew. On the fourth morning, he entered the stables and stopped. The dirt floor, usually a mess of straw, manure, and dust, had been meticulously swept. The aisles were clear. His horses, usually restless, were calm, their feed troughs neatly topped. He was not being haunted. He was being kept. An invisible hand was mending the frayed edges of his solitary life. It was a barter. He left the sack of meal on the porch, and it vanished in the night. In its place, the ranch was tended by a ghost. He felt a pull to know where she was. He was a rancher. His instincts were to track, to understand the patterns of the creatures on his land. He rode out, not toward the ridge, but up to Juniper Pass, a high notch in the rocks that gave him a view of his entire property. He found the ashes. They were in a small, concealed hollow, sheltered from the wind. It was a smokeless fire, the kind a skilled scout would build, designed to give heat without a visible plume. The ashes were cold, at least a day old, but the spot was perfect. It overlooked his house, the well, and the road to Sable Arroyo. She was watching him. She was guarding her investment, or guarding him. The thought made his chest tighten. He needed supplies. The silent exchange of meal was one thing, but he was low on coffee, salt, and cartridges. The trip to Sable Arroyo was unavoidable. He hitched his wagon, his movements clumsy, his mind still on the cold ashes at Juniper Pass. Sable Arroyo was less a town than a handful of clapboard buildings clinging stubbornly to the dust. It had a general store, a blacksmith, a livery, and the Oxbow Saloon. As Calder tied his wagon, he felt the familiar eyes of the town on him. The loafers on the saloon porch, the women peering from behind curtains. The virgin rancher had come to town. He was buying his salt when a voice, dry as the alkali flats, cut through the store's gloom. "You look spooked. Calder, see a ghost up on your mesa?" He turned. Mercy Vale was leaning against the counter, a small bag of what looked like willow bark in her hand. Mercy was a town fixture and, like him, an outsider. She was a white woman, past middle age, who had come to the territory 20 years ago as a wife and was now a widow, and the region's only midwife. She lived alone in a small cabin up the wash, respected for her skill but feared for her sharp tongue. She wore a man's hat, and her face was a map of sun-scorched wrinkles. Just the usual. Calder mumbled, looking down at his boots. Mercy's eyes, pale blue and sharp as glass, missed nothing. "The usual doesn't make you jump at the sound of a closing door. I hear things. Calder, word is, you lost some provisions." Calder's head snapped up. "Who told you that?" "Orville Gant was in the Oxbow last night, buying rounds." Mercy's voice lowered, talking loud about how that book-dumb sodbuster Wren finally got hit by thieves, talking about hostiles up on Cinder Mesa, talking about raising a posse to protect your property. A cold, hard knot formed in Calder's stomach. Orville Gant was a deputy, a man who wore his badge as an excuse to bully and posture. "He's a fool," Calder said, his voice flat. "He's a dangerous fool," Mercy corrected him. "And he's got his eye on your ranch, or at least on the Apache." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You're a good boy, Calder, but you're a soft one. You stay out of tribal business. You see any hostiles, you ride the other way. You're not built for that kind of trouble. It's not your fight." Calder picked up his sack of salt. He looked at Mercy, and for the first time, his gaze did not falter. The man she was describing, the soft one, the boy, had died 2 nights ago in the grain shed. "Thank you for the warning. Mercy," he said. Her eyes widened slightly. The tone was new. It was quiet, but it was not soft. It was the flat, solid sound of a decision made. "Just be careful. Calder, some things, once stirred, don't settle back down." He nodded, paid his bill, and left the store, the weight of Gant's name heavy in his mind. He drove his wagon out of town, the rumor gnawing at him. Wren's ranch thief. The words made him angry. He thought of the rope burns. He thought of the obsidian knife. He thought of the swept stables. This was not a thief. This was Loma Nyende. He did not know how he knew her name. It just arrived in his head, fully formed, as certain as the name of his own mesa. He knew, with a certainty that settled into his bones, that he had already chosen his side. He had chosen it the moment his hand had eased on the stock of the Spencer, the moment he had lowered the barrel. Mercy was wrong. It was his fight now. It had become his fight the second she had paid him for his meal with a tool she likely needed to survive. A cold, fine mist began to fall as he neared his ranch, a rare and unwelcome winter dampness. It was full dark by the time he'd unhitched the team. He was checking a loose rail on the corral, a rail he'd gashed with a poorly aimed axe 2 days prior when he felt it. The change in the air, the prickle on his neck. He turned. She was standing at the fence line, not 20 feet away. The mist clung to her, making her seem less a person of flesh and blood than an earth spirit, a tall column of shadow and damp air. She did not move. He did not move. The silence of the night was broken only by the drip of moisture from the stable roof. He had 1,000 questions. Who was Gant who had put those ropes on her? Why was she here? He asked none of them. He simply waited. Loma took 1 step forward, her bare feet silent in the mud. She held something out. He squinted, unable to see in the gloom. He stepped closer, his boots squelching, until only the fence rail separated them. She opened her hand. In her palm was a small, damp bundle of crushed herbs, dark green and pungent. He could smell it from where he stood, a sharp, clean scent of creosote and sage. She looked at her offering, then looked at him. She lifted her other hand and pointed, not at him, but at his left forearm. He looked down. The gash from his misplaced axe blow was an angry red line, oozing slightly, inflamed by the wet and the cold. It was a language without sound. "You are hurt. This is medicine." He slowly, carefully, reached over the fence and took the bundle of herbs from her hand. Her fingers were cold, but her palm was rough and strong. The brief touch sent a jolt through him, more powerful than a lightning strike. He held the poultice, unsure what to do. She watched him, her expression unreadable in the dark. Then she did the most astonishing thing. Her lips, which he had only seen set in a line of exhaustion or grim pride, quirked. It was not a smile. It was the memory of one. It was a faint, fractional lift at one corner of her mouth, a flicker of light in her dark, deep eyes. It lasted no more than a second, and then it was gone. But he had seen it. It was trust. It was the smallest, most fragile seedling of trust, pushing its way up through the ashes of a burned-out world. It was a recognition. You and I, we are not enemies. And in that instant, Calder Wren felt the last of his old, lonely life fall away. She held his gaze for one more heartbeat, then turned. The mist swallowed her. She was gone, as if she had never been, leaving only the sharp scent of herbs and the lingering image of that impossible, heartbreaking smile. Calder stood in the rain, the cold seeping into his bones, but he felt a warmth he had not known he was missing. The next morning, the mist burned off, leaving the sky a harsh, brilliant blue, and Calder saw them. High above, circling on the thermals, were the dark specks, vultures. They were riding the wind, waiting as the desert always waits. He looked at the antiseptic poultice now bound to his arm. He looked at the circling birds. A storm was coming. He did not know what form it would take, but he knew he would not be facing it alone. The ghost vanished, and the woman took her place. She did not come back under the cover of mist or shadow. She returned in the high, unforgiving glare of a 2 o'clock sun, when the heat pressed down from a brass-colored sky and the world was bleached of all subtlety. Calder was on his knees by the west fence, wrestling with a split post. The wood was old, the wire brittle. His hands were clumsy with frustration, and he'd sworn twice, the words sounding small and useless in the vast, quiet mesa. He was measuring a length of new wire when his hands stilled. The hairs on his arm, the same arm that now bore a cleanly healing line where the poultice had been, seemed to prickle. He did not need to turn. He felt the weight of her presence, the simple displacement of the air. He rose slowly, dusting his knees. Loma Nyenda stood not 10 yards away, on the outside of the fence line. She was not holding a weapon. Her hands were empty at her sides. She wore the same torn buckskin shirt, but she had washed it, and her hair, though still wild, was free of the burrs and mud. She had been to the creek. The rope burns on her wrists were fading, turning to pale, shiny scars. She looked less like a hunted animal and more like a person. A very tall, very tired person. She watched him, her gaze level. She was not asking, "I will work," she said. Her voice was low and rough, like stones rubbing together, but the words were clear. English, learned somewhere, sometime, for food. It was a contract, a negotiation. It was, in its own way, more respectful than any thank you could have been. Calder nodded once, a short, jerky motion. "The post," he said, gesturing with his pliers. "It's rotted through." She did not wait for a second invitation. She studied the post, the wire, the lay of the land. Then she walked, not to him, but to a small stand of mesquite, and with a strength that made Calder's eyes widen. She began to break off a straight, seasoned branch. She worked with an economy of motion that was almost painful to watch, for it made his own fumbling efforts seem wasteful and loud. They worked for the rest of the afternoon, and a new rhythm was born on Cinder Mesa. It was a rhythm of two. They mended the fence. Calder's method was nails, staples, and brute force tension on the wire. Loma's was different. She used leverage, retying his clumsy knots with a few quick, intricate twists that held tighter than any staple. She found a spot where the ground was soft and, using a flat rock, dug a new post hole in half the time it would have taken Calder with his shovel. The next day, they moved to the stable. A roof beam, cracked during a summer storm, sagged dangerously over the horses. It was a job Calder had been putting off, a job too big for one man. Now, there were two. He stood on the ladder, her on the ground. "And when I lift," he grunted, "push the support pole under it." She looked at the pole, at him, and shook her head. She walked to the wall, picked up his heavy felling axe, and handed it to him. Handle first. Then she pointed at a spot on the main support. He understood. He swung, creating a small notch. She did the same on the support pole. They were building a joint, not just a prop. "Now," she said. He heaved. She did not just push. She lifted. He felt the wood groan, saw the muscles in her shoulders and back bunch and lock, and the massive beam rose a clean 2 inches. She set the support, her movements precise. He hammered the joint shut. The sound of their work echoed across the yard. His hammer was a heavy, steady thud. Her movements were a sharp, efficient thwack and scrape. It was a cadence. It was the sound of a home being built, not just repaired. It was the heartbeat of hope, pounding itself back into the dry wood and the packed earth. Language came, but it was not the language of people. It was the language of the land. He was reshoeing his mare, his back aching. He rode slumped, his father's way. Loma watched him, her head tilted. She walked up to the horse, put one hand on Calder's lower back, and pushed. Hard. "You sit like a sack," she said. It was not an insult. It was a fact. "The horse carries you." She tapped his thigh, then his calf. "You must carry the horse, ride with the wind, not against it." He sat up, mortified. But he tried it. He felt the change in the horse's gait immediately, a smoother, easier stride. He felt, for the first time, like a partner to the animal. Not just its burden, he, in turn, taught her. He found her staring at the pages of an old, water-damaged catalog on his porch. He brought out a pencil and a piece of scrap wood. He drew a letter. "Hey," he said, his voice rusty. She took the pencil. Her hands, so strong and sure with an axe, were clumsy. She drew the A. Her tongue caught between her teeth. She looked at it, and the ghost of that smile, the one from the rainy night, returned. It was a small, bright thing. They spoke in names. Chola, he'd say, pointing to the spiny cactus. Ocotillo, she'd reply, pointing to the thin, whip-like stalks. That one, she said, stopping by the creek bed, pointing to a dusty green shrub. Good for fever. That cloud, he said, pointing to the horizon. Rain in 2 days. She sniffed the air, a long, slow intake. 1 day. She corrected him. The wind smells of salt. She was right. The rain came the next afternoon. The change in Calder Wren was not lost on the few people who saw him. He rode into Sable Arroyo for more nails and a bag of coffee beans, and he stopped at the smithy. Rafael Cardenas, the blacksmith, was hammering a glowing orange bar of iron, his face slick with sweat. He was a man built on a different scale from Calder, broad and powerful, with a laugh that could shake the dust from the rafters. He stopped his hammer blows and plunged the iron into a trough, a violent hiss filling the shop. He turned, wiping his face, and his broad grin faltered, turning into a look of genuine curiosity. Calder, he said, his voice warm. You are here. Good. Calder nodded. Need 10 pounds of nails. Raphael, and... Can you fix this harness buckle? Raphael took the broken buckle, but his eyes were on Calder's face. Calder was not looking at the floor. He was not hunched. His shoulders, though tired, were square. Amigo, Raphael said softly. You look different. How's that? Calder asked. Uncomfortable. The loneliness, Raphael said, tapping his own chest. It is a heavy coat. You have been wearing it since your father passed. Today. You are not wearing it. You stand taller. You look calmer. Calder had no answer. He just held the blacksmith's gaze. Raphael's smile returned, quieter this time, and full of a deep, knowing warmth. It is good. Whatever you have found on that mesa, you keep it. It is good for you. He clapped Calder on the shoulder, a blow that nearly staggered him. The nails are inside. I will fix this buckle. No charge. That evening, the new rhythm found its way inside the house. The work was done. The rain had passed, leaving the air washed clean and cold. A fire crackled in the hearth. Loma had not left. She had brought in a load of firewood without being asked, and was now sitting at his small kitchen table. Calder was cooking a skillet of salty, pan-fried beef and a pot of thick, bitter coffee. It was the only meal he knew how to make. He put a plate in front of her. She looked at it. It was plain food. Survival food. She picked up a piece of the beef with her fingers and ate. They ate in silence. But it was not the cold, empty silence Calder was used to. It was the silence of two people who had spent 10 hours in each other's company, who had read each other's movements, anticipated each other's needs. It was the silence of a shared truce. Calder, trying to cut a tough piece of meat, fumbled his knife. It clattered loudly on the plate and skittered onto the floor. He cursed softly, his face flushing red. He bent to pick it up, and when he sat back up, he saw it. Loma was looking at him, her hand covering her mouth, but it was not fast enough. Her shoulders were shaking, just slightly. A small sound escaped her, a low, breathy chuckle. Her eyes, so often filled with shadows and exhaustion, were crinkling at the corners. The lines of worry and fear melted away, and for a full 5 seconds, she was not the Apache fugitive, not the giant, but just a woman, laughing at a clumsy man. The laugh died as quickly as it came, and she looked down, as if embarrassed. But Calder was staring, his heart doing that strange, erratic dance again. He had never seen anything so beautiful. He found the tracks 3 days later. He was checking his water cisterns up in Ghost Gulch, a narrow canyon that held a small spring. The water level was low, dangerously low, and he saw them, wheel tracks, not from his wagon. They were wider, with a strange, deep tread he did not recognize. Someone was stealing his water, in the middle of the night, in large quantities. He knelt, his good mood evaporating. This was not a desperate man with a canteen. This was organized. He took the pencil and a scrap of paper from his pocket and carefully sketched the tread pattern. That evening, Loma was gone again. He had grown used to her sudden departures. She would vanish into the hills for a day or two at a time, checking snares, or just needing the solitude. He was mending his shirt on the porch, the stitches clumsy, when he saw it, hanging on a wooden peg by the door, where his father's hat used to be, was a small, faded blue neckerchief. It was hers. He had seen her wear it to tie back her hair. She had left it. It was not a gift. It was not payment. It was a placeholder. It was a sign. It was a promise, unspoken, that this was now a place she returned to. He touched the cloth. It was soft. That night, as he lay in his cot, he heard it, carried on the clear, cold wind. It was a sound that did not belong to the mesa, a sound of the future, of the world beyond. It was a thin, mournful cry, miles and miles away. A train whistle. The survey crews for the railroad, pushing west. Calder closed his eyes. He felt the soft cloth of the neckerchief in his mind. He heard the distant, iron wail of the train. An invisible underground river of feeling was rising in him, deep and slow and powerful. He was standing on a patch of dry ground, and he could feel the water beginning to seep up through the cracks all around him. The train whistle was no longer a distant, mournful cry. It was the sound of an iron serpent slithering closer, and it was rattling the windows of the Oxbow Saloon. Inside, the air was thick with smoke, cheap whiskey, and the new electric hum of greed. At a back table, two men sat who had not been in Sable Arroyo a month prior. One was Orville Gant, his deputy's badge a tarnished spot of tin on his dusty vest. He was a man who operated in a state of perpetual, simmering anger. The other man was his opposite. Luther Pike was dressed in a clean, dark suit. His hands were soft, and his voice was as smooth and flat as the railroad ties he laid. He was the foreman for the Trans-Arizona survey crew, and he looked at the map spread on the table, not as a landscape, but as a problem of logistics. "The grade through the Cholla Ridge is too steep," Pike said, tapping the map. "It'll cost us 6 months and $50,000 in blasting, but this—" His finger moved, tracing a line. "This flat land, Cinder Mesa, it's a perfect staging ground. And look," he tapped another spot. "Ghost Gulch, water, enough for our engines and our crews, right where we need it." Gant took a long pull of whiskey. "That's Wren's land. The fool." "The fool," Pike agreed, "is currently sitting on the most valuable parcel of land in this county, and he doesn't know it. He is also," Pike added, his voice dropping, "known to be harboring a hostile Apache. A female, I'm told, a giant." Gant's eyes lit with a mean-spirited, eager light. "I heard the talk. They say he's shacked up with her. The virgin rancher finally found a squaw." "The morals of it don't interest me," Pike said, folding his hands. "The opportunity does. A citizen harboring a fugitive, a threat to the public good, a danger to the railroad's right-of-way. These are terms the territorial government understands. They are terms that allow for an expedited seizure of property, for the sake of security, of course." Gant grinned, showing yellowed teeth. "Security, I like that. We run him off." "We don't run anyone, deputy," Pike corrected him, his voice like cold steel. "We are men of law. We will make him a fair offer, which he will refuse. Then, you will deliver an official warning. And if he still refuses to see reason, well, the territory is a dangerous place. Things happen. Barns burn. Cattle wander. People get hurt. And a grieving man is often much more willing to sell cheap and move on." "And the water?" Gant asked, his mind on the immediate theft. "Keep taking it. We need it. And he hasn't got the spine to stop you." Pike slid $2 silver across the table. "Buy the bar around. Spread the word. We're here to bring prosperity. But this man, Calder Wren, is standing in the way of progress, and he's doing it for an Apache." The town, desperate for the railroad's promise of jobs and money, began to divide. In the general store, the talk was of paychecks and new customers. In the shadows, it was of a man's right to his own land. Calder felt the shift when he rode in for livestock feed. Men who used to nod to him now looked away. or worse, stared at him with a new, cold curiosity. As he was loading his wagon, Mercy Vale stepped out from the livery. "They're talking Calder," she said, her voice low, not bothering with pleasantries. "Let them," Calder said, heaving a sack. "You don't understand." She grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "This isn't town gossip. This is a railroad. They don't just ask, they take. I've seen it before. In Kansas. They come with money, then they come with lawyers, and when that fails, they come with men like Gant." She looked around, her eyes sharp. "Listen to me. These men, Pike and his kind, they're like the dust. You'll see their boots, but you won't see their faces. The red dust hides their feet, but it's the paper that will hide their hands. They'll bury you in warrants and liens until you're too poor to fight back." A cold dread, sharper than the winter air, settled on Calder. "What do I do?" "You can't win," Mercy said, her voice flat. "But you can sell. Take the money and go. This ranch isn't worth your life. And it surely isn't worth the life of—" She paused, looking toward the mesa. "The one you're helping. It's not for sale," Calder said. Mercy looked at him, a long, appraising stare. The soft boy was gone. "Then God help you," she said, and turned away. "God help you both." The help of God did not arrive. Orville Gant did. He came 2 days later, not with a posse, but with 3 hard-looking men from Pike's survey crew, all of them wearing pistols and the smug look of men who knew the law was on their side. Loma, who had been splitting wood with Calder, saw them first. She did not run, she simply stilled, her hand on the axe handle, her eyes fixed on the approaching riders. "Go inside," Calder said, his voice quiet. "I do not run," she said. "This is not a fight. It's a talk. They want to see you gone. Don't give them the reason. Go!" She held his gaze, then nodded once, a sharp, angry motion. She slipped the axe inside the barn and then vanished into the small ranch house, closing the door with a quiet, final click. Calder stood on the porch, his hands empty, as Gant and his men reined in, deliberately trampling a patch of his small garden. "Wren," Gant sneered, not dismounting. "You've got a visitor. You're not welcome here." "Gant," Calder said. His heart was hammering so hard he was sure they could see it in his chest, but his voice came out steady. "That's not your choice to make." Gant unrolled a piece of paper, a document with a fancy seal at the top. "This here is an official warrant from the territorial magistrate. Says we have reason to believe you are harboring a fugitive from the San Carlos reservation. Says we have the right to search your property and seize said fugitive." He held it out. Calder walked down the steps and took it. His hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was rage, cold and clear. He read the paper. He read it twice. He saw the magistrate's name, the charges, and then he saw the signature at the bottom. It was not the judge. It was a clerk, and the date was for next Tuesday. "This isn't valid," Calder said, looking up. Gant's smile faltered. "What'd you say?" "This paper." Calder held it up. "Is post-dated. It's for next week. And it's not signed by the judge, just his clerk. It's not a warrant. It's just a piece of paper. You're trespassing." Gant's face went from smug to a dark, mottled red. "You booked dumb. I am the law here." He made to dismount, his hand going to his pistol. "I wouldn't," Calder said. The door of the ranch house opened. Loma Nyenda stepped out onto the porch. She had been in the house less than 5 minutes, but she was transformed. She had unbound her hair, and it fell around her shoulders, a thick, black cascade. She had taken off her worn shirt and put on a beaded Apache tunic, one Calder had never seen, one that must have been hidden in her small bundle. It was a garment of ceremony, of power. She did not look at the men. She looked out, over their heads, toward the mesa, as if they were nothing but insects on her land. She was not a fugitive. She was a queen. She was taller than any of them, and the setting sun lit her from behind, casting her in a silhouette of fire. Gant's hand froze. The man beside him, The one from the railroad crew, visibly paled, and his horse, sensing the man's fear, took a nervous step back. They were men of violence and superstition, and this woman looked like no mortal they had ever seen. She was the land itself, and she was not afraid. "I believe," a new voice cut in. "There's been a misunderstanding." Luther Pike rode up, his horse a fine, clean chestnut, his suit immaculate. He looked annoyed. "Mr. Wren," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "My apologies. Deputy Gant is overzealous. He's merely concerned for the safety of this community." Gant looked furious, but he said nothing. Pike dismounted and walked toward Calder, stopping a polite 5 feet away. He ignored Loma completely. "Sir, my name is Luther Pike. I represent the railroad. We are bringing progress, and we need this valley. We need a staging ground, and we need that water in Ghost Gulch. Your ranch is in our way." "It's my ranch," Calder said. "It is," Pike agreed. "And I'm prepared to buy it. Right now. Cash." He pulled a thick envelope from his coat. $500. More than your father paid for it. More than it's worth. Cash today, and you and your companion are free to go. No questions asked. Peace tomorrow. $500. It was more money than Calder had ever seen. It was enough to go to California, to be safe. He could feel Loma's presence behind him, a silent, steady weight. He thought of the barn repairs, the shared, silent meals, the way she had taught him to ride. He looked at Pike. "No." Pike's smile did not waver, but his eyes went cold. "I see. You're making a mistake, son. It's not for sale," Calder said again. Pike stared at him for a long, hard second. Then he nodded, as if Calder had just confirmed a sad fact. "Very well. Have a good evening." He mounted his horse, gave a sharp look to Gant, and the 4 men turned and rode away, their horses' hooves a quiet, drumming threat in the dusk. Calder let out a breath he did not know he was holding. He turned. Loma was still on the porch, but she was looking at him now, her gaze unreadable. "They'll be back," she said. "I know," he said. They came back that night. It was Loma who woke him, her hand on his shoulder, shaking him. "Fire!" she hissed. Calder was out of the cot in a second. He smelled it, the acrid, choking smell of burning hay. He ran to the door and his heart stopped. The north barn, the one they had just repaired, the one with the new joint, was a tower of flames. The fire was roaring, orange and red against the black sky, already eating through the roof. "The horses!" Calder yelled, grabbing a bucket. "No!" Loma shouted, grabbing his arm. "The roof will go! It is too late for the barn! Get the horses from the corral! I will slow it!" He ran to the corral, his heart pounding with sick, hot terror. The animals were screaming, rearing, their eyes white with fear. He ripped the gate open, smacking their rumps, driving them out into the open wash. Loma was already at the pump, a silhouette against the inferno. She worked with a desperate, focused energy, filling bucket after bucket, not throwing them on the barn, it was a lost cause, but on the roof of the small stable next to it, on the grass, on the house, creating a wet line, a fire break. Calder joined her. They worked as a single being. There was no talk, only the gasp of breath, the clang of the pump handle, the hiss of water on hot embers, and the terrible, hungry roar of the fire. They were not saving the barn. They were saving the ranch. They worked for an hour, their faces black with soot, their lungs burning, their arms aching, until the barn's main beam, the one they had mended together, finally gave way. It collapsed in on itself with a groan, sending a geyser of sparks high into the night sky. A final, defiant explosion. And then there was only the sound of sizzling, of popping wood, and their own ragged breathing. They stood side by side, watching the last of their work turn to ash. The firelight flickered over them, casting long, dancing shadows. Calder looked at Loma. Her face was grim, her eyes reflecting the dying flames. In them, he saw no fear, He saw only a resolve that matched his own, a hardness that had been forged in a fire much hotter than this. He looked down. In the muddy, wet ground, illuminated by the orange glow, he saw them, the tracks, the wide, strange wheel treads. They were deep in the mud, leading from the road, around the burning barn, and pointing back toward town, back toward the oxbow. He pointed. Loma nodded. She had already seen them. This was not a random act. This was the answer to his refusal. This was Pike's peace. Calder picked up the singed, empty bucket. His hands were raw, his knuckles bleeding. He looked at the smoking ruins, at the woman standing beside him, at the dark, predatory hills. The soft boy was gone. The virgin rancher was gone. We will build it back, Calder said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. We will do this the right way, and we will win, our way. The fire was an act of man, a scar of malice. The storm was an act of God, an erasure. It came from the north 3 days after the fire, a wall of churning, sulfur-colored dust that climbed 5,000 feet into the sky. It did not just approach, it swallowed the sun, the mesa, and the sky in a single, suffocating gulp. The wind, which had been a whisper, became a physical shriek, a solid thing that hammered the ranch. Calder and Loma had spent those 3 days in a grim, silent fury of work, sifting ashes, salvaging what tools they could, and beginning to frame a new, smaller, more defensible structure where the north barn had stood. They had not talked about the fire. They had not talked about Pike or Gant. They had worked until their hands were raw and their bodies screamed for rest. And then they had worked more. When the wall of dust appeared, Loma was the first to see it. She said one word, inside. Not the house. The house was too exposed. She pointed to the grain shed, the small, sturdy building where they had first met. It was filled with sacks of salvaged feed, tools, and the few supplies they had. They ran, the first scouring grains of sand stinging their faces like needles. They slammed the door shut just as the world dissolved. The sound was immediate and terrifying. It was not a whistle. It was a deafening, abrasive roar, the sound of a mountain being ground into powder. The small shed, the one they had reinforced together, shuddered. Sand began to pour in through every microscopic crack, dusting the air, coating their tongues. Daylight vanished. The world was reduced to a small, dark, roaring box. They sat on stacked sacks of feed, their shoulders brushing. For the first hour, they just endured. There was no thought, only the overwhelming presence of the storm. The wind found a loose board and created a high-pitched, agonizing scream that did not stop. In the dim, dusty light, Calder tried to rewrap the bandage on his left hand. The burns from the fire had been tended by Loma's herbs, but the work of the last 3 days had torn them open. He was clumsy, his fingers stiff and shaking, not from cold, but from sheer, bone-deep exhaustion. He fumbled the cloth, and a low, frustrated sound escaped his throat. "Be still," Loma's voice cut through the din, not loud, but close. He stopped. He felt her shift on the sack beside him. He could barely see her face, just a silhouette against the sliver of light from a knothole. She took his burned hand. Her touch was not what he expected. His mind knew her as a figure of imposing height and incredible strength. But the fingers that enclosed his were not rough. They were calloused. Yes, but they were precise and unbelievably gentle. She did not just grab his hand. She held it, as if it were a fragile, wounded thing. He had a small tin of salve Mercyvale had given him once, which he'd been ineffectively smearing. Loma took it from him, her other hand coming up to rest on his knee. A simple, grounding weight. She did not just apply the salve. She opened his fingers, one by one, and began to work the medicine into the raw skin around the burns. Her movements slow and rhythmic. The pain, which had been a sharp, angry fire, began to recede, replaced by a dull, warm throb. Calder watched her bent head, the way her hair fell forward, shielding her face. His own breathing was harsh and shallow. "Breathe," she commanded. not looking up. Not from here. She tapped her own chest. From here. She touched her stomach. Breathe with the storm. Do not fight it. He tried. He let out a ragged breath and drew in a long, slow one, tasting the grit in the air. He did it again. She was right. The knot of pain and anger in his chest began to unclench. She finished wrapping the hand in a clean strip of cloth, her motions economical and perfect, but she did not let go. She just held his hand, her thumb rubbing a slow, steady circle on his unburned palm. The wind shrieked, the shed vibrated, a small, fragile boat in a sea of sand. And in that darkness, surrounded by the roar, the silence between them became profound. It was a silence so deep it pulled the truth from them. I have been alone, Calder whispered, the words torn from him. For so long, even when my father was here, I was alone. He had not expected to say it. The confession, so stark and simple, hung in the air between them. He felt her hand tighten on his. She turned her head, and, though he could not see her eyes clearly, he felt her gaze. I, too, she said, her voice rough. To be chosen is to be safe. To be unchosen is to be a stone. I have been a stone. For a long, long time. He understood. The virgin rancher and the Apache fugitive. Two different kinds of isolation, two kinds of loneliness. But here, in the dark, they were the same. He turned on the sack, his body shifting toward her. She did not pull away. He could feel the warmth of her breath, smell the scent of sage and clean sweat that clung to her. He raised his uninjured hand, the one she was not holding, and he did not know what he meant to do. He only knew he had to touch her. His hand was shaking. He laid it against the side of her face, his fingers sliding into the thick, soft mass of her hair. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. A sigh, long and shuddering, escaped her. Calder, she breathed, and his name on her lips was a new, beautiful sound. He leaned in. It was a clumsy, desperate movement. He was the virgin rancher. After all, he knew nothing of this. He was expecting her to be the stone she spoke of, a thing to be admired for its strength. He was wrong. She met him halfway. Her lips were not hard, but soft. They were chapped, and they tasted of dust and salt and her. His first kiss was not a taking. It was a discovery. It was a question. Are you here? Her hand, the one not holding his, came up to clasp his wrist, the one that was holding her face. She was not pushing him away. She was holding him closer. And her lips answered, yes, the kiss, which had started with a fumbling, desperate sincerity, deepened. It was not a fire, it was water. It was the end of a thirst so profound neither of them had known they were dying of it. It was slow. It was not rushed. There was no world outside to hurry them. There was only the roar of the sand, and the quiet, solid miracle of her mouth, and the sudden, overwhelming relief of not being alone. He felt the tension of 1,000 days, a lifetime of solitude, break inside him. His hand in her hair tightened, and he pulled her, or she pulled him. He would never know which. They did not fall. They settled. They shifted on the rough sacks until they were sitting side by side, but with his body turned into hers, his forehead resting against her temple. His arm was around her shoulders, and her arm was around his waist, her hand resting on his back. They were breathing the same dusty air, their heartbeats, which had been pounding, slowly beginning to find a shared, steady rhythm. His old, worn canvas coat, the one he'd been sitting on, lay beside them. He fumbled for it, and with his one good hand, he draped it over her shoulders, and then his own, a small, shared tent within the larger shelter. The fire in the hearth, the screen. Calder's imagination, which had never been bold, had not dared to dream of this. This was not a dream. This was real. This was a strong arm around his back, and the solid weight of a head leaning against his. They sat like that for hours. They sat as the wind howled and the sand piled up against the walls. They sat in a silence that was no longer empty, but full. It was full of her breath, and his, and the simple, monumental fact of their shared survival. As the roar of the wind began to lessen, as the high-pitched shrieking descended into a low, weary moan, she spoke, her voice a low rumble against his chest. "My people," she said, "say a woman's strength is in what she can make, a man's is in what he can defend. They are both wrong." He was still, listening. He felt her fingers trace the line of his jaw. "Strength," she said, "is not in the fist. It is not in the axe. It is in holding, in choosing what you will not let go. It is in this." Her hand, which had been at his waist, covered his own, the one she had bandaged. "To hold the one you choose." He felt the weight of her words. She was not just talking about strength. She was talking about them. She had chosen. He closed his eyes, his heart aching with a feeling he had no name for. It was bigger than gratitude, more painful than hope. "I will learn," he whispered, his voice thick. He was not a fighter. He was not a great man. He was clumsy, and he had been a coward for most of his life. But that was over. "I will learn to be worthy of being held." She did not answer. She simply squeezed his hand. They sat, wrapped in the coat, until the last of the wind died, and the only sound was the faint tick-tick-tick of sand settling. When the first light came, it was through the knothole, a single, pure beam of light that cut through the dusty darkness and illuminated her face. She was asleep, her features softened, the lines of worry and exhaustion erased. Calder watched her, and he knew. The storm had passed. The world outside had been scoured, remade, and so had he. The sky, when they finally opened the door, was a high, brilliant, aching blue, washed clean of all dust, all doubt, their love, born in desperation and sealed in the storm, was no longer a question. It was the foundation, the peace, born in the storm's clean-washed sky. Lasted less than 24 hours. The new foundation they had built was not yet settled before the next tremor hit. Calder found it at dawn. He went to the well, the one place she had first left her mark, and saw it immediately. It was a piece of smoothed, flat wood, a piece of a barrel stave, stuck into the damp earth by the well's lip. It was not his, it was not Loma's. Carved into its surface, crudely but with undeniable force, were a series of symbols. Calder, who had learned the language of the land but not of men, could only stare. He brought it back to the house. Loma was inside, braiding her hair. She looked up when he entered, the faint, soft look from the previous day still in her eyes. Then she saw what was in his hand. The softness vanished. It was as if a steel door had slammed shut. Her face became a mask, the one he had seen in the grain shed, the one she had worn when Gant arrived. She took the piece of wood from his hand. Her fingers traced the carvings, and her breath hitched, a tiny, almost inaudible sound. "What is it?" Calder asked, his voice tight. "A message," she said, her voice flat and cold. She was not looking at him. She was looking past him, at the wall, at a future she had been running from. "From who?" She laid the wood on the table. "He is named Taeth. He is the eldest son of my chief." She paused, her jaw working. "He wants me back." The simple words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Back. It was a word of ownership. It implied she was a possession that had been misplaced. "Loma," Calder said, stepping toward her. She held up a hand, a gesture that stopped him cold. She turned, not to him, but to the window, looking out at the vast, empty mesa that was suddenly no longer a sanctuary. "I did not tell you," she said, her voice a low monotone. "There was no need. You were a man. I was a shadow. Now, Calder said, his voice firm. "We are us. Tell me." She took a long, shuddering breath. "I was promised to him. A bargain, made by my father, to join two clans. I was a child. He was a man who liked to break things, horses, dogs, people." Calder felt a cold sickness rise in his throat. "When it was time," she continued, "I refused. I was the first woman in 3 generations to say no, to refuse the son of a chief." Her voice was devoid of pride, just a statement of fact. They called me a fool. Then they called me a traitor to my people. When I would not bend, they confined me. They tied me. The rope burns. Calder's hand, his bandaged hand, clenched into a fist. The burns he had seen that first night, they were not from a white man's rope. "I was a stone," she whispered. "But a stone can be broken." I waited. And when the guard was drunk, I left. I took nothing. I ran. I have been running for 3 months. I have been crawling. I have been starving. She turned to face him, and her eyes were not the eyes of the woman who had laughed at his clumsiness, or the woman who had kissed him in the dark. They were the eyes of a hunted animal, raw with a pain he could not touch. "He wants me back," she repeated. "Tayeth does not lose. He does not allow what is his to be free. He will hunt me until I am dead, or he is." "He's not like Gant," Calder said, trying to understand the new, complex lines of this war. "Gant," she said, a bitter, sharp sound that was almost a laugh. "Gant is a dog who barks. Tayeth is a snake who waits. Gant wants this land. Tayeth wants me. He wants my will, broken, in his hand." The danger, which had been a clear line between him and Pike, now became a tangled, bloody knot. It was not just his ranch. It was her life. The proof of her words came 2 days later. He was riding the ridge, checking for stray cattle after the storm. He looked out over Stone Wind Flats, the wide, empty plain miles to the east. They were just specks at first, but his eyes, trained by the sun, picked them out. 4 riders. They were not cavalry. They were not cowboys. They rode low, fast, and without formation, their ponies kicking up small puffs of dust. They were Apache, and they were circling. Not attacking, just watching. They were the outriders, the scouts. Tayeth's men. They were marking the territory. They were penning her in. Calder rode back to the ranch, a cold knot of dread in his stomach. The world was shrinking, and the walls were closing in. He told Loma. She simply nodded, as if he were confirming that the sun had risen. The knowledge of her past, of the hunt, seemed to have encased her in a new, harder shell. Rafael Cardenas came that evening, driving his smithy wagon. He did not come to town, but directly to the ranch, his face a mask of worry. "Mercy told me," he said, climbing down, his broad chest heaving. "She told me about Gant, about the fire, Dios, Calder. This is not a fight. This is an execution." He looked at Loma, who stood on the porch, her arms crossed, her face closed. Rafael, a man of great warmth, gave her a respectful, almost fearful, nod. "Listen to me, both of you," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I have a cousin in Santa Fe. He runs a freight line. I can hide you both in my wagon, under the tools. We leave tonight. We ride hard for 3 days. You can be in New Mexico by the week's end. A new place, a new name. This Pike, this Gant, this Tayeth." He stumbled over the name, which he had clearly been told by Mercy. "They will not find you." It was a lifeline. It was escape. It was sense. Calder looked at the smoking ruins of his barn, at the circling riders in his mind, at the threat of the law and the railroad. He looked at Loma. He saw the hunted look in her eyes, and he wanted, more than anything, to erase it. "We will go," Calder said, his voice thick. "No." The word was absolute. It came from Loma. She stepped down from the porch, and she was, once again, the giant, the pillar of smoke and earth. "Rafael," she said, and her voice was gentle, but unbreakable. "You are a good man, but I will not run. I have run, I have crawled through the dust of this territory. I have eaten roots, and I have hidden like a coyote." She looked at Calder, and her eyes softened for just a second. "Here, I have stood up, I have held an axe, I have sat at a table." She looked back at Rafael. "If I run now, I will run forever. This is my place. This is where I stop running." Rafael looked at her, and his worldly, practical arguments died on his lips. He saw what Calder saw, not a victim, but a woman who had drawn a line in the sand with her own soul. He sighed, a great gust of air, and nodded, his shoulders slumping. "Then you are both fools," he said, but his eyes were full of a new, profound respect. "And I am the fool who will help you." Mercy, when she heard, was less respectful. She arrived the next day, her face a storm. "So," she snapped, "you've decided to be martyrs. Wonderful. Gant will love it. He'll get a medal for shooting a wild Apache, and Pike will get your land at auction. We're not running." "Mercy?" Calder said. "Fine," she snapped. "Then don't run, but don't be stupid. You're trying to fight a gun with your fists, and a railroad with your pride." She turned, not to Calder, but to Loma. "They're going to say you're a savage. They're going to say you're a threat. They'll say you attacked him." She pointed at Calder. "And that Gant was a hero for putting you down." Loma's eyes narrowed. "So," Mercy continued, her voice like a drill, "we make sure they can't. Not easily." She looked back at Calder. "I'm bringing some of the women from town, the wives of the ranchers Gant has bullied, the ones who hate Pike for poisoning their water. I'm bringing them here. They're going to see her. They're going to see a woman, working, cooking, mending, not a hostile. And when Gant comes, he won't just be facing you. He'll be facing the town's wives. He'll be facing witnesses." It was a desperate, brilliant plan. A different kind of army. The two-front war was now fully engaged. While Mercy gathered her witnesses, Gant made his move. He saw the new threat, the Apache riders. As a gift, he rode to Pike's camp, his hat in his hand. "That squaw," he said. "Her people are here. They're warriors. I saw them. They're going to burn the whole valley. Pike. They're a threat to your railroad." Pike, who understood only levers, saw a new one. He gave Gant a crate. It was full of new, gleaming rifles and boxes of ammunition. "For the defense of the town, deputy," Pike had said, his voice smooth. "Protect our investments. Do what you must." Gant now had a posse. He had new weapons. And he had a legal, public excuse protecting the town from an impending Apache raid. A raid that had started, conveniently, at Calder Wren's ranch. Calder, meanwhile, was fighting his own battle. The one Mercy had warned him about. The battle of paper. He rode not to Sable Arroyo, but to the county seat in Tucson. A 2-day ride. He spent his last few dollars. He did not go to the sheriff. He went to a small, dusty office in the basement of the courthouse. The county clerk. He handed the man a letter. It was simple, polite, and written in his clumsy, self-taught hand. It was a formal request, as a citizen, to see the original land surveys and all filed purchase agreements by the Trans-Arizona Railroad, citing the fire on his property as a reason to fear for his claim. The clerk, a small man with ink-stained fingers, looked at him over his spectacles. "This could take weeks. Son, I'll wait," Calder said. And he did. He sat on a bench for 2 days, sleeping in his saddle blanket on the courthouse steps, until the annoyed clerk finally, grudgingly, gave him what he wanted, just to be rid of him. He rode back with the copies in his shirt, his heart pounding. The papers were a maze of legal language. But one thing was clear. Pike's survey maps, the ones filed with the county, did not go through Cinder Mesa. They went through the Cholla Ridge, the expensive route. Pike was lying. He had no legal claim to be there, no official right-of-way. He was trying to get the land cheap before he filed the new route, using Gant to scare Calder off. It was the first piece of solid ground Calder had found. He arrived back at the ranch, exhausted, but with a sliver of hope. He found Loma on the porch, staring east. He did not need to ask. He could feel it. The air was different, tight, like the skin of a drum. And then he heard it, miles away. From the direction of Stonewind Flats came the sound. A low, rhythmic thump, thump, thump. It was a sound that vibrated in the bones, a sound that spoke of blood and ritual. War drums. Tayeth was no longer scouting. He was announcing his arrival. Calder's small victory with the papers felt like ash in his mouth. That was a war of paper. This was a war of blood. Loma stood like a statue, carved from the red rock of the mesa itself. She was not the woman from the storm. She was not the woman who had fled. She was the woman who had said no. She was choosing, once again, to stand her ground. The moon began to rise, and in the far distance, on the edge of the horizon, a new light flickered. It was not a star. It was a fire, then another, and another, a line of signal fires, answering the drums. The threat was no longer a rumor. It was here. Calder went to her, standing beside her on the porch. He did not touch her. He just stood, a silent partner at her side. "They will come at dawn," she said. Her voice was calm, a terrifying, absolute calm. "I know," he said. He took her hand, the one he had bandaged. It was strong, and it was cold. She turned to him, and her eyes in the moonlight were deep, dark pools. She was not looking at a savior. She was looking at a partner. He leaned in, and his kiss was not the slow discovery of the storm. It was a hurried, desperate, brutal in its honesty claiming. It was a prayer in the dark. It was goodbye. And it was I will not leave you, all in one. She kissed him back. A fierce, brief pressure. A sealing of a pact. There were no more words to say. There was no time. He let her go. They stood, side by side, and watched the fires burn on the horizon. Two small, unbroken figures against the vast, encroaching, and murderous night. The drums stopped at dawn. The silence that followed was worse. It was not a silence of peace, but of anticipation, a held breath. The signal fires were dead, leaving only smudges of smoke against the pale. New sky. Then came the rider, not a warrior, a boy from town. His pony lathered. He reined in at the fence, his eyes wide with fear, and threw a piece of paper at Calder. "Judge wants you," he yelled. "Town meeting. Now." "What meeting?" Calder shouted back, but the boy was already gone, riding hard back to Sable Arroyo. Calder looked at the paper. It was a formal, hurried summons. "Emergency hearing on the matter of public safety and the Cinder Mesa property." "It's a trap," Loma said, her voice flat. She was scanning the hills, not the paper. "Gant's trap." "While Taeth watches from the rocks." "It's a court," Calder said, his jaw setting. "He's using paper, so I'll use paper." He went inside and pulled the documents from Tucson from his saddlebag. He also grabbed a small, singed ledger book. "You are going?" she asked, her disbelief clear. "We are going," Calder said. "Mercy's plan. They want to see a hostile." He looked at her. "They'll see a woman, and they'll hear from witnesses." He rode fast, Loma on his second-best mare beside him. She rode as he had never seen a person ride, as if the horse were a part of her own body. They did not look like a rancher and his companion. They looked like two sovereigns, riding to a parley. The Oxbow Saloon was packed. It was not a court, but it was the only building in town big enough. Judge Hemlock, a small man whose authority came entirely from his association with bigger men, sat at a rickety table at the front, looking miserable. Luther Pike stood beside him, looking confident, his hands clasped behind his back. Orville Gant and his new deputies, the railroad men, stood by the door, their new rifles gleaming. The air was thick with fear. When Calder and Loma walked in, a wave of silence fell. All eyes went to her. Loma did not flinch. She simply walked, her head high, and stood at the back wall, a silent, tall shadow that commanded the room. "Mr. Wren," Judge Hemlock stammered. "This is an emergency session. In light of the, clear and present danger," he gestured vaguely toward the hills. "And in light of your association with, well, get on with it, Judge," Pike said, his voice smooth. "The facts are simple. The Apache are on the warpath. Mr. Gant has confirmed this. They are using Cinder Mesa as a staging ground. Mr. Wren is either a hostage or a collaborator. In either case, for the good of this town, for the safety of the railroad, we are filing for an emergency seizure of the Cinder Mesa property under the Territorial Defense Act." A collective gasp. Seizure, not a purchase. a taking. You can't, Calder said, his voice clear and loud. It did not sound like the virgin rancher. It sounded like his father. I can, son, Gant sneered from the door. It's for the public good. Then you should know, Calder said, walking forward, that the public is being lied to. He threw the copies from Tucson on the table. This is Pike's filed survey map from the county clerk. His official route goes through Cholla Ridge, not my land. He has no legal business on Cinder Mesa. He's not protecting the railroad. He's stealing water and trying to scare me off cheap. Pike's smile tightened. That's an old survey. Outdated. Is this outdated? Calder said. He held up the singed ledger. This is my claim for the barn fire. I filed it with Deputy Gant, as required. He opened it to a page. And this is the compensation waiver. Gant said I had to sign it to get any help. Funny thing. He held it up. Gant was in such a hurry to file it. He signed the witness line himself, and he spelled his own name wrong. A few nervous titters from the crowd. Gant's face turned a shade of purple. That's not all. Calder said, he said the fire was an act of God, but I have a witness who says otherwise. All eyes turned. Mercy Vale stepped forward from the crowd, where she had been standing with 3 other ranchers' wives. I was at my cabin, Mercy said, her voice clear as a bell. The night of the fire, I saw a wagon, a heavy-load coal wagon, heading up the wash toward Wren's place about an hour before the flames. I thought it was strange. Too late for freight. And did you recognize this wagon? Calder asked, his voice like a lawyer's. I did, Mercy said. It's the same wagon the railroad crews use, the one they use to fuel the survey engine. The saloon was silent. Pike, for the first time, was visibly sweating. He was no longer the man in charge. He was a man in a trap. A wagon, Pike scoffed. It means nothing. Then perhaps, a new voice boomed. This means something. Rafael Cardenas pushed his way through the crowd. He was carrying his heavy blacksmith's hammer in one hand, and he looked furious. He was not a man anyone wanted to cross. I am a smith, Rafael said. I know iron. I know every nail, every rivet in this county. I helped my amigo sift the ashes of his barn, and I found this. He reached into his pocket and threw a small object onto the judge's table. It clattered loudly. It was not a nail. It was a heavy, uniquely shaped iron spike. This, Rafael said, pointing at Pike, is a rail tie-down spike, but it is not a normal one. It is a specific model, a keystone pattern, used only by the Trans-Arizona line. I know, because they tried to hire me to forge them. He turned to the crowd. I found this in the ashes, under the main beam, where the fire was hottest. This was not an act of God. This was an act of the railroad. The room exploded. The murmurs became shouts. Thief! Murderer! He burned him out. The men who had shunned Calder were now pounding him on the back. The tide, in one violent, crashing wave, had turned. Pike was pale, holding his hands up. This is preposterous. Circumstantial. Gant did not bother with words. He knew his power. His hand was on his pistol, his new deputies fanning out, their rifles ready. Shut up, all of you, he roared. The law is talking. You aren't the law, Gant, Calder yelled back, pointing at the spike. You're a hired arsonist. Gant's face contorted. He drew his pistol, leveling it at Calder. You're dead, Wren. The women screamed. The men pushed back. And at that exact moment, a sound from hell cut through the chaos. It was a long, low, wailing cry, a sound that none of them, not even the oldest prospectors, had ever heard. It was not a coyote. It was not a man. It was a battle horn, an Apache, echoing off the high rocks. The sound of the saloon died, choked off in an instant. All the anger, all the righteous fury, all the legal arguments evaporated, replaced by a single, primal, blood-chilling terror. The real war was here. Gant's grin returned, a ghastly, triumphant thing. He had his justification. See, he hissed, his pistol still up. The savages are here. I'm the only one who can save you." Judge Hemlock, who had been hiding under his table, scrambled up. This hearing is adjourned. It's a military matter now, Deputy Gant. You're in charge. Secure the town." Gant laughed. He holstered his pistol and looked at Calder, his eyes full of a new, legal, and righteous hate. "We'll settle this out of law. Wren," he said, his voice low. "My way? And I'll be seeing to your squaw first." He and his men shoved their way out of the saloon, leaving a wake of terrified, now silent townspeople. Calder, blind with rage, moved to follow him. Gant, a hand, strong as iron, grabbed his arm. Loma, she had not moved from the back wall, but her eyes were electric. She pulled him back, her grip unbreakable. "No," she said, her voice a low hiss. "Do not trade your life for his anger. That is what he wants. He wants you to draw. He wants to kill you in self-defense. He is a rabid dog. He's going to, he said," Calder stammered, his fury so great he could not speak. "He said words," she said, pulling him out the side door, away from the panicked crowd. "Now we act. We do not fight their fight. We fight our fight. He's coming for us. Loma with rifles, and Taeth is in the hills." "I know." She was calm, her mind already working, already 10 steps ahead. Gant will be slow. He will be drunk on his new power. He will gather his men. He will come from the road, the way he knows. Taeth, he is different. He will come from the high ground. He will come to be seen. She pointed to the west, to a high, flat-topped butte that stood apart from the main mesa. Its sheer cliffs glowed a deep, bloody red in the afternoon sun. "Red Lantern Bluff," she said. "He will go there. It is a place of power. He will want to talk, to show me his strength, before he attacks." "So we're trapped," Calder said, his hope turning to ash. "Gant from the road, Taeth from the bluff." "No," she said, and her hand was still on his arm, a current of strength flowing into him. "We do not wait here. We do not hide in the house. We choose the ground." She looked at him, her gaze clear and absolute. "We will go to the bluff. We will be there first. We will hold the high ground. We will force both of them to come to us. We will make them speak before they shoot." It was an insane plan. It was a brilliant plan. It was the only plan. Calder nodded. The rage was gone, replaced by a cold, clear focus. He looked at the saloon, at the frightened townsfolk. He looked at the hills. He ripped a piece of white cloth from a discarded feed sack by the wall. He found a long, thin piece of mesquite. With his knife, he tied the white flag to the end of the pole. Loma raised an eyebrow. "Surrender." "No," Calder said, his voice hard as the rock they were about to climb. "An invitation. A demand. This is our land. This is our fight. And they will talk, or they will die. But they will do it in the light, where everyone can see." The moon rose. It did not rise as a pearl, or a silver coin, or any of the kind things poets wrote about. It rose over Cinder Mesa as a bloody, diseased eye, swollen and weeping. An old, full moon. It passed through a high layer of dust, the last remnant of the great storm, and it drank the color of the iron-rich hills. It was a blood moon, and it bathed the territory in a light that looked like a fresh wound. Red Lantern Bluff, aptly named, seemed to ignite. The high, flat-topped butte drank the crimson light and glowed. A platform of sacrifice. And on that platform, they waited. Calder and Loma had climbed the treacherous goat path in the dying, gray light of dusk. They carried rifles, water, and the small, defiant white flag. Calder had jammed the pole of the flag into a deep crevice in the rock, where it hung, a pale, ghostly surrender in the bloody air. They sat with their backs to a high boulder, sheltered from the wind, their faces turned toward the east, toward the drums. The drums had stopped at sunset. The silence, now, was absolute. A vast, terrible silence that stretched from their high, cold perch all the way to the horizon. "He will come," Loma said. She was not looking at Calder. She was scanning the plains below. Her eyes, accustomed to the dark, catching every flicker of movement. She was wearing her ceremonial tunic, her hair unbound. She was not a fugitive. She was a warrior queen, waiting on her throne. "I know," Calder said. His old Spencer was across his knees. His bandaged hand was stiff, but his trigger finger was steady. The man who had been the virgin rancher was a lifetime ago. He felt ancient. Then they heard it, not drums, the scrape of a hoof on stone, then another, a faint jingle of a bridle. They came up the wide, sloping eastern trail. Not the goat path. They did not come as a rabble. They rode in a V formation, 2 by 2, a silent, disciplined wedge of shadow. At their head rode one man, larger than the others, his shoulders broad, his seat on his pony absolute. They stopped 100 feet from the summit, where the bluff widened. 10 riders, their forms, silhouetted against the plains below, looked like centaurs, unearthly, their ponies tossing their heads, sensing the tension. The man at the front, Tayeth, kneed his pony forward. He rode into the full, sick light of the moon, and Calder finally saw his face. He was a man made of hard lines, his jaw a blade, his eyes deep set and burning with a cold, absolute arrogance. He was not a brute like Gant. He was a man of power, a man who had never been told no. He reined in 20 yards from them. His 10 riders fanned out behind him, a silent, deadly crescent. Some held rifles, others sinew-backed bows. Tayeth looked at Loma. He looked through Calder, as if the white man were nothing but a pale, uninteresting shrub. "You have led a long chase. Loma Enaide," he said. His voice was not a shout. It was a deep, resonant baritone, smooth and mocking. He used her full name, a claim of intimacy. "You have run far, little bird, and you have found a small rock to hide under." His gaze finally, dismissively, slid to Calder. He looked Calder up and down, taking in the canvas coat, the worn boots, the pale, determined face. "So this is it," Tayeth sneered, a small, cruel smile playing on his lips. "This is what you chose over your chief, your people, a white-skinned dirt farmer, a boy who smells of milk and fear." Calder's hand tightened on the Spencer. "He calls himself Wren," Tayeth continued, his voice rising, projecting for his men. "A tiny bird. How fitting. Did he offer you his nest? Loma, did you trade your honor for this, rancher?" "I have my honor," Loma said, and she stood. She rose to her full, magnificent height, stepping out from the shadow of the boulder, away from Calder, to stand alone in the center of the crimson stage. The moonlight caught the beadwork on her tunic, making it flash like drops of blood. "I have my honor, Tayeth," she repeated, her voice clear and strong. It did not tremble. It carried on the wind, a sound as clean and sharp as obsidian. "I am not a bird you can cage. I am not a horse you can break. And I am not a gift to be given." She took a step toward him. I chose freedom. I did not choose a master, and I did not choose you." The insult hung in the air, electric and deadly. Calder saw the muscles in Tayeth's jaw clench. The man's arrogance cracked, revealing the raw, violent pride beneath. "You are a thing," Tayeth roared, his control breaking. "You are the property of the people, a wedding gift. Promise to me you have defied your father. You have defied your chief, and you have shamed your blood." "My blood is my own," Loma said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous level. "And I will not have it spilled by you, nor will I have yours. You have no choice." Tayeth raised his hand. "Caesar!" 2 riders began to nudge their ponies forward. "No." The word was Calder's. It was not loud, but it cut through the tension. Tayeth's head snapped toward him, his eyes wide with disbelief that this shrub would dare to speak. Calder stood. He did not raise his rifle to aim it. He did not drop it in surrender. He took 3 steps forward, his boots crunching on the gravel, and he turned the Spencer carbine downward. With a single, powerful motion, he jammed the barrel into a crack in the rock. planting it. The rifle stood on its own, a strange wooden monument, a marker. Then, his hands empty, Calder slowly unbuttoned his canvas coat. He pulled it open, holding the lapels, showing his plain cotton shirt underneath. He was showing he wore no armor. He was showing he held no pistol. He was showing he was utterly, completely vulnerable. It was a statement, clear as any words, spoken in the language of the West. I will not shoot first. Tayseth stared. This was not courage as he understood it. This was not a challenge. It was an insult. It was a white man's trick, a fool's gesture. It was madness. You are a coward, Tayseth spat, infuriated by the gesture. You will not fight, you will die like a dog, hiding behind her. I'm not hiding, Calder said, his voice steady, his coat still open. I'm standing. This is my land, and she is my guest. He could not bring himself to say wife, to say love, to use a word that would give Tayseth more ammunition. And you are not welcome here. Taeth's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He had been shamed by a woman and defied by a fool. He had come for a capture, but his blood was up. He wanted a killing. He raised his hand high, a sharp, clear signal. Across the crescent, 4 of his riders, the ones with bows, raised them. They knocked arrows in a single, fluid motion. The sinew-backed bows bent, and 4 deadly, obsidian-tipped points were aimed, not at Loma, but at the center of Calder's chest. This was the end. Calder met Taeth's gaze. He did not flinch. He did not close his coat. He held his ground. Loma, seeing the archers, seeing the killing in Taeth's eyes, took a single, sharp breath, and she raised her hand, not in surrender, not in a plea. She raised it straight up, palm forward, a signal, a command. And the mountain answered, down on the switchback trail, the one the townsfolk used. A light flickered, a single pinprick of light, amber and warm, in the vast, bloody dark. Taeth's riders, distracted, glanced at it. Then another light appeared, and another, a line of them, coming up the slope, like impossible stars, a string of beads held by human hands. It was Mercy Vale, and behind her, Rafael Cardenas, his blacksmith's hammer held like a mace, and behind them, the women from the town, and behind the women, their husbands, the men from the saloon, the ones who had seen the faked papers and the railroad spike. They were terrified. They were holding pitchforks and old shotguns, but they were there. They were a crowd of 20, maybe 30 people, their faces pale and strange in the crimson moonlight. And they were all carrying lanterns, red lanterns, the kind used on wagons, their glass panes glowing like defiant hearts. They formed a line, a barrier of light, 100 yards down the slope, cutting off the bluff from the valley, trapping Taeth between the armed townsfolk below and the defiant couple above. They were witnesses. Taeth spun his pony, his eyes wild. He saw them. He saw the shotguns. He saw the pitchforks. He saw, more importantly, the faces, white faces, 20 of them. His mind, quick and sharp, saw the trap. He had come to retrieve his property. That was tribal business. But to kill a white man who had not drawn on him, and a fugitive. In front of 30 white witnesses, he would be a butcher, not a warrior. He would bring the cavalry, the army, a full-scale war, down on his people. He had come to settle a matter of honor, and he was now horribly, publicly, stuck. His honor was his cage. He could not attack a man who would not fight. He could not murder in front of a crowd. His authority, which had been absolute, was now gone, stolen by a handful of lanterns. Loma stepped forward again, into the silence, her voice ringing out, for Taeth, for the riders, and for the townsfolk below. You see, Taeth, she called, there are no gifts here. There are only choices. You have yours. I have made mine. She pointed to Calder. He has made his, and the people of the valley, they have made theirs. She turned, her voice a vow. If any man dies on this bluff tonight, it will not be for freedom. It will be for stubbornness. It will be for a pride that is already broken. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of the grave. Calder stood, His coat open, Loma stood, her hand outstretched. Tayeth sat on his pony, his face a hell of indecision and rage. The first to break was an archer. He was a young man. He looked at Tayeth. He looked at the line of lights. He looked at Loma, and the unbending, impossible courage in her face. Slowly, the string of his bow loosening, he lowered the arrow. One by one, the other 3 archers followed, their bows unbent. The stalemate was broken. Tayeth saw it. His own men had faltered. He was defeated. He stared at Loma, and the look in his eyes was no longer just anger. It was a hatred so pure, so cold, it would last 1,000 years. It was the hatred of a man who has been completely, publicly, and profoundly unmade. He did not speak. He did not give a command. He gathered his reins, and with a guttural, disgusted sound, he spat on the red rock of the bluff. Then he wheeled his pony around, a violent, rearing turn, and raked his heels. He galloped back down the trail, his 10 riders, silent and ashamed, following in his dust. Calder did not move. Loma did not move. They watched until the last sound of the hooves had faded into the vast, bloody night. He let out his breath, a ragged, shuddering sound, and his knees finally, terrifyingly, buckled. He caught himself on the rock. Loma turned. She looked at him, at the planted rifle, at his open coat. She looked at the line of lanterns, the silent, watching town. The first battle was over. It had been won not by bullets or by steel. It had been won by a piece of paper, a string of red lights, and the 2 words a woman had been brave enough to say, "I choose." The descent from Red Lantern Bluff was not a victory march. It was a weary, terrified procession, the townsfolk clutching their lanterns, their shotguns, and their newfound conscience. The blood moon was setting, leaving the sky a bruised, pre-dawn purple. They had faced down a war chief, but the air was still thick with the other, more familiar poison, Orville Gant. Mercy Vale was at the center of the crowd, the ranchers' wives holding her arms, their voices a low, trembling buzz. In all my days, you were magnificent. Loma, both of you." Calder and Loma did not join them. They walked at the rear, their rifles still in hand, their eyes scanning the dark, empty spaces between the buildings of Sable Arroyo. The town was a trap. They knew it. Orville Gant had not been at the bluff. He had been at the Oxbow, drinking, his new deputies, the railroad men, at his side. When the townsfolk had lit their lanterns and marched out, Gant had laughed. "Let the fools go and get scalped." He'd slurred. "More for me when they're gone." But then, hours later, the crowd had returned, not in pieces but whole, triumphant. Luther Pike was at the bar with Gant, his face a pale mask of fury. He had seen the procession. He had lost. "It's over, deputy," Pike said, his voice a low, cold hiss. He placed a small bag of coins on the bar. "Your services are no longer required. The company is pulling out." Gant stared at the bag. He looked at Pike. He looked at the swinging doors as the first of the returning townsfolk, Rafael Cardenas, entered, his face grim. Gant was not just a bully. He was a public bully. And he had just been made a fool. Twice. Once by a dirt farmer he'd failed to burn out, and now by a tribe of Apache who had just left. He had lost his town, he had lost his paycheck, and he had lost his power. His rage, thick and sour as the whiskey, needed a target. It found one. Mercy Vale. She was the one who had spoken up, the old crone who had turned the town. She was standing outside the saloon, talking to Raphael. Gant moved. He was not a man with a plan. He was an animal, cornered and lashing out. He shoved past Raphael, grabbed Mercy by the arm, and jammed the barrel of his pistol into her neck. "It ain't over," Gant screamed, his voice a ragged tear in the quiet morning. "It ain't over till I say." Raphael froze. Mercy gasped, her face ashen. "You like to talk, old woman," Gant snarled, dragging her into the street. "Talk your way out of this. I'm still the law." "Gant, you're drunk," Raphael yelled, holding his hands up. Let her go. I'm the law, Gant roared. And he began to drag Mercy, stumbling, toward the one place of power he had left, Pike's Railroad Depot at the edge of town, where the new rifles were stored. I'm taking a hostage, you tell Wren. You tell that squaw. They come to me. They come to my court. Calder and Loma heard the shout. They ran, their boots pounding in the dust, just in time to see Gant barricade himself and Mercy inside the rail yard's main warehouse. The town, which had been victorious moments before, was now frozen in a new, sick terror. He's lost his mind, Raphael panted, joining them. He'll kill her. He's got nothing left to lose. He's got the depot, Calder said, his mind racing. The rifles? The ammunition? He thinks he's a fort. Loma was not looking at the building. She was looking at the sky. A few drops of rain, heavy and cold, began to fall, turning the dust to a dark, pasty mud. A fine mist began to blow, obscuring the hills. Good, Loma said. He is a man of fire. He will hate the water. She looked at Calder, then at Raphael. He is one man. We are three. He is a coward. He has a hostage. So we can't rush him, Calder said. We don't, Raphael said, his eyes on the wagons parked near the depot. But he plans to leave. Those are freight wagons. He'll take the rifles, take Mercy, and run. A plan formed, born of their three different minds. Raphael, Calder said. The wagons. Can you stop them? They have brakes, Raphael said. A grim smile. Brake lines can be cut. No, Loma said, her voice sharp. Too loud. And he will check, but... She pointed to a large, 50-gallon drum of axle grease and oil. Sitting by the loading dock. He is a snake. We will make his hole slippery. The oil. Calder nodded, understanding. You and Raphael, spill it, all of it, on the dock, by the door, by his wagons. And you, Raphael asked. He wants me. Calder said, he wants to see me. I'll be the diversion. When I have his eyes, you get Mercy. No, Loma said. A flat command. You will be the diversion. I will get Mercy. You do not know how to be silent. There was no time to argue. She was right. The red lanterns were still in the hands of the townsfolk, a small, terrified cluster of light in the growing, misty rain. Give them to me, Loma commanded. The wives, not questioning, handed them over. She gave 6 to Raphael. Hang them, on the wrong side of the yard. Make him look there. Make him think the town is coming from the west. It was a brilliant, simple trick. Raphael and Loma moved. 2 shadows in the gray. Wet mist. Raphael, strong as a bull, tipped the heavy oil cask. A thick, black-green river of sludge poured silently over the loading dock, coating the steps, the ground, the hitching posts. It was not flammable, but in the rain, it was a sheet of black glass. Loma moved to the side of the warehouse, to a window that was cracked open for ventilation. She was as silent as the falling rain. Calder stepped out into the middle of the street, 50 yards from the main door, his hands empty at his sides. The mist swirled around him. Gant, he yelled, his voice echoing in the wet. You wanted me. I'm here, let her go. The warehouse door cracked open. Gant's eye, wild and bloodshot, peered out. He saw Calder. He laughed, a raw, ugly sound. That's right, Wren, the virgin rancher. Come to beg you and your savage. Where is she hiding? She's gone. Calder lied, his voice shaking just enough to be convincing. She saw Taeth and she ran. It's just you and me. Let Mercy go. This is between us. Is it now? Gant sneered. He shoved the door open, dragging Mercy out onto the loading dock. The pistol was at her temple. It's between all of us. You think you've won, I still have her. He did not see the black sludge. He took a step, a confident, swaggering step, and his boot hit the oil. His feet flew out from under him. He went down, a crash of limbs, his body hitting the dock with a sickening thud. The pistol flew from his hand, skittering across the slick boards. Now, Calder roared. But Loma was already there. She had not come from the side. She had come from above. She dropped from the low roof of the dock onto Gant as he was trying to scramble for his gun. She did not strike him. She did not use a weapon. She landed on his back, and in one fluid, terrifyingly precise motion, she grabbed his left arm, spun, and locked his elbow and shoulder. A non-lethal, bone-grinding hold. Gant screamed, a high, thin sound of pure agony, a sound no one had ever heard him make. He was immobilized, his face pressed into the grease. At the same instant, Luther Pike, who had been inside the depot, burst from a side door, not to help, but to flee. He had a bag of money in his hand and was running for a light buggy. He saw Gant go down. He saw Loma. He saw Calder running. He was done. "He's getting away!" Calder yelled. Pike whipped the horse, the buggy lurching into the street. "No, he is not!" Raphael's voice boomed. The blacksmith, having finished his work, had gone for his own heavy, iron-laden smithy wagon. He drove it directly out of an alley, blocking the street, a wall of wood and iron. Pike, his horse at a gallop, had no time. He yanked the reins, trying to swerve. The buggy's wheel hit the slick mud of the road, and the entire flimsy vehicle slid, tilted, and then toppled, plunging over the side of the street and into the deep, churning, brown water of the black silt wash. There was a great splash, and then only the sight of two wheels, spinning uselessly in the air. It was over. The real county marshal arrived 2 hours later, summoned not by the fight, but by Calder's official complaint from Tucson. He found a strange scene. He found Orville Gant, covered in grease, tied to a chair in the center of the oxbow, his arm in a crude sling, surrounded by silent, armed townsfolk. He found Luther Pike, soaking wet, shivering, and stripped of all his dignity, sitting in the mud by the creek, guarded by Mercy Vale, who held a dry shotgun. And he found Calder Wren and Loma Nyenda, standing by the bar, drinking coffee. The legal part was fast. At the makeshift court, the marshal looked at the forged fire document. He heard Raphael's testimony about the spike, and he heard 30 different people tell him, in one unified voice, that Orville Gant had kidnapped the town midwife. He signed the warrant. Gant, stripped of his badge, was put in iron cuffs, a sight that broke the last of his power. Pike, charged with fraud, conspiracy, and arson, was cuffed beside him. The marshal, seeing the copies of the real survey maps, put a legal injunction on all railroad property, pending a federal investigation. The plan to seize Cinder Mesa was not just dead, it was buried. The townsfolk were ashamed. They were grateful, but they were Westerners, and they did not know how to say, "I'm sorry." So, 2 days later, they said it with their hands. Rafael Cardenas arrived at Cinder Mesa with a wagon full of new, seasoned timber. Mercy arrived with 3 other women, their arms full of seed grain, canvas for mending, and jars of preserves. The men from the saloon, the ones who had jeered at Calder, came one by one, hammers in their hands, bags of nails in their pockets. They did not talk. They did not make speeches. They just started to work. They began, as a community, to rebuild the barn they had allowed to be burned. Calder and Loma stood on the porch and watched them. Loma turned to go inside, to fetch water for the workers, and she saw it, stuck, quivering. In the doorpost where her neckerchief had hung was an arrow. It was black-fletched, with a single red band, Taeth's mark. It had not been shot. It had been placed. A message, a promise. She pulled it out. Tied to the shaft with a piece of sinew was a small, dried serpent's rattle. A warning. This is not over. Calder saw it. His joy at their victory turned to cold ash. The war of paper was won. The war of blood was just waiting. He looked at Loma. She looked at the arrow. Then at him. She did not look afraid. She just looked tired. She broke the arrow over her knee and threw the pieces into the dust. They did not celebrate their victory. They did not kiss. They did not embrace. The townsfolk were working. There was a barn to be built. Calder picked up his hammer. Loma picked up the water bucket. Like true survivors, they simply turned and got back to the work. The seasons do not care for the dramas of men. They turn indifferent and absolute. The bloody, violent winter bled out, and a tentative, hard-won spring crept into the valley. And that spring, born of water from the repaired cisterns and seed grain from the town, gave way to a summer of relentless, focused work. Now, it was the time of the first harvest. On Cinder Mesa, a field of barley, green gold and heavy-headed, rippled under a mild September sun. It was not a large field. It was the patch of land Calder had always thought was fallow. The patch Loma had shown him was fed by a hidden, underground seep. They had planted it together, in the shadow of the half-built barn, while the town looked on. Today, the town was here again, but they were not witnesses. They were partners. The ranch had changed. The very air of it was different. It was no longer the isolated, lonely outpost of a virgin rancher. It had become a place. It was not a fortress, but it was no longer open to the world. It was open to its people. There was a new, unspoken rule on the Sea Monitor Mesa Ranch. There was no line between owner and guest, between charity and work. Anyone who came to the gate was met. If they were hungry, they were fed. If they needed shelter, they were given a place in the new, sprawling, and beautifully constructed barn. And if they stayed more than one day, a tool was put in their hand, a hammer, a scythe, a water bucket. You ate, so you worked. You worked, so you ate. It was the simple, unbreakable law of the new community, Loma's law. She, herself, had put her own mark on the place. One afternoon, she had sat on the porch, her hands busy, not with an axe or a knife, but with a piece of sinew and a small bag. She had been stringing beads. They were not the fine, colorful trade beads, but beads she had made herself of polished bone, of dark, smooth river stones, of dried, hardened yucca fruit. It was a long, patient work. When she was finished, she did not wear the string. She hung it. She tied the sinew loop to the main beam of the porch, the one that looked out over the valley. It hung there, a small, rattling, earthy piece of jewelry for the house itself. It was her string of decision. It was her flag, her neckerchief, her promise. It was the public vow of a free woman, hanging on the door of her chosen home. The town, too, was healing, and it was healing in their direction. Mercy Vale, having found her voice in that saloon, had decided never to silence it again. She had declared that ignorance was a disease, just like fever, and she was the cure. In one of the empty, abandoned buildings by the livery, the one Pike's Railroad had used as an office, she had opened a school. She taught the ranchers' wives how to read their own mortgages. She taught the young men how to sign their own names, and in the afternoons, she taught the children. There were 5 of them, children who had never held a book, who had only known the dirt and the dust. Mercy taught them their letters, their numbers, and, most importantly, she taught them gently. There was no switch, no ruler, no harshness in that small, bright room. Calder and Loma, passing by, would hear the sound of laughter, a sound that had been almost as rare as rain. It was a place of absolute safety. The sun was beginning its slow, gorgeous surrender, painting the sky in the old, familiar colors of apricot and rust, but the colors no longer looked like blood. They looked like warmth. They looked like a promise. Calder and Loma sat on the top step of the new porch. The sounds of the day were winding down. The thud of hammers had stopped. The last of the townsfolk were heading down the path, their voices low and weary, but satisfied. Calder's hand, no longer bandaged, but scarred, lay on the step. Loma's hand was beside it. He uncurled his fingers, and she slid her own into his. Their palms, both calloused, both strong, met. It was a familiar, daily gesture, a simple, solid fact. Raphael says, Calder said, his voice quiet, that the new well should be dug by the spring. He thinks we've found the main water table. He is right, Loma said. She was leaning her head back against the porch post, the post that held her beads. The water here is strong. It does not run away. We'll have enough for the stock and for the new foals. He squeezed her hand. The mare, she's ready. A month, maybe. Less, Loma said. She is restless in the morning. 2 weeks. She smiled. That small, secret smile he had come to crave. We will need a bigger stable. A bigger stable, he mused. More grain, another barn, maybe. On the south slope? A house, she said, so softly he almost did not hear it. He turned to look at her. The house is fine. The house is your father's, she said, her gaze steady. It is small. It is a house for one. We are more. The roof will leak this winter. He looked at the small, dark box of a house he had grown up in. He looked at the sprawling, magnificent new barn, built by a dozen hands, and he looked at her. Yes, he said, a house with bigger windows and a door that faces the sun. She said. The silence that fell between them was full and warm. The last light of the sun touched her face, and he felt that familiar, aching lurch in his chest, the one that was no longer loneliness, but a fullness so profound it was almost painful. He stood, pulling her hand. Come on. Where? I don't know, he said. And he was the virgin rancher again, clumsy and uncertain. The yard. The moon is new. She understood. She stood with him, her height, her strength, a solid, living presence beside him. They stepped off the porch and onto the patch of hard-packed earth between the house and the barn. The dust was cool under their feet. A thin, silver-white crescent moon, the ghost of a moon, hung in the deep, velvet sky. He did not know how to ask, so he just opened his arms. She stepped into them. It was not a dance. They did not know the steps. It was a hold. His arms went around her waist, and her arms, after a moment's hesitation, went around his neck, and they just stood. They stood in the center of their ranch, in the center of their new, hard-won world, and they held each other. Then he began to move, a slow, shuffling sway from one foot to the other, his boots whispering in the dust. It was the rhythm of the wind, the rhythm of the barley, the rhythm of his own steady heart. Loma, who had been a stone, a pillar, a warrior, melted against him. She let her head rest on his chest, her hair, smelling of sage and smoke, against his face. He rested his chin on the top of her head. He had never felt so strong. He had never felt so safe. He looked up at the new moon, at the vast, starry darkness. He thought of Gant and Pike and the long, terrible chase. He thought of the man he had been. Loma, he whispered, his voice thick, burying his face in her hair. I belong where you chose me. He felt her body tense, and then a long, shuddering sigh came out of her. Her arms tightened around his neck, her strong, sure hands clasping behind his head, holding him. And you, she whispered, her voice a vibration against his heart, are the ground I chose to stand on. You are my home, Calder Wren. He could not speak. He just held her. The world, the threat, the future, all of it dissolved. There was no Taeth. There was no railroad. There was only the solid, warm, living miracle of her. In his arms, in the dark. They swayed, a single, two-hearted shadow, under the pale, new moon. And after a long, long time, they just stood, locked in a long, unbroken, and perfect embrace, their breathing. Finally, one. The next morning, Rafael Cardenas, who had come to check the well, left a gift on their doorstep. It was not a grand gesture. It was a single, newly forged horseshoe. It was shiny, the hammer mark still fresh on it, the curve perfect. Tucked into the bend was a note. It did not say, congratulations. It did not say, good luck. It said, in Raphael's clear, strong script, for the luck of those who know to choose the right fight. That night, the town of Sable Arroyo did something new. It was a Saturday. There was no festival. There was no emergency. But one by one, as dusk fell, the red lanterns came out. Mercy lit one and placed it in the window of her school. Raphael lit one and hung it over the door of his smithy. The ranchers, the wives, the men from the oxbow, they lit their lanterns. Not as a defense, but as a celebration. It was a new tradition, a sign that this town was no longer a place of fear, but a place of witnesses, a place that would hold the line. In the land of the West, the law of survival was often said to be written in lead. It was a harsh, unforgiving creed. But those who said so, who believed that the bullet and the blade were the only truths, they had not seen Cinder Mesa. They had not seen a field of barley growing from ash. Here, in this small, forgotten corner of the territory, a different truth had been proven. That kindness, when it is brave, can be a weapon. That courage is not the same as violence, and that love, when it is stubborn, when it is chosen, when it is fought for, can bloom, bright and defiant, right in the middle of the stone, on the porch. Calder and Loma stood, watching the distant, warm, red lights of the town. They were not alone. She took his hand. He looked at her, and she at him. Their story, the one of violence and running, was over. Their road, the one of the new house and the new moon, and the child who would one day laugh in a safe, warm school. That road had just begun. They turned, together, and looked out at the long, pale sliver of light on the darkness, the faint, clear promise on horizon's step. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please drop a comment below, share your thoughts, and let's build this community. Be sure to subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video. And if you really want to support what we do, hit that hype button to help this story be heard by more folks.